Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is Reformed Thinking, and this is where we take your stack of sources, articles, research notes, sermons, and distill the most vital knowledge into a conversation designed specifically for you.
Today, we are taking on a big one. It's arguably the most systematically organized document in the Christian faith, the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans.
It really is, and the source material you shared with us frames this letter in a fascinating way. It's not just presented as a theological masterpiece, which of course it is, but also as a highly sophisticated, real-world strategic briefing.
Yeah, a mission document built on a doctrinal foundation.
Right.
And that's a crucial distinction. Our objective today is to first establish the operational context, the who, what, when, and where of the letter's composition.
Okay.
And then we're going to systematically dissect Paul's core argument. We're examining the complete blueprint of salvation he lays out, but we need to see it through this dual lens.
So it's a grand explanation of the righteousness of God. But at the same time, it's also a very specific logistical request for support for a major mission he was planning, a Western mission expansion.
That's it. Well, look at the specific city Paul was writing from. The surprising reason he needed the Roman church's logistical help and, how he structured his argument.
All those chapters of careful theology.
Right. All of that was designed to solve these potential relational and theological issues between Jewish and Gentile believers before he even set foot in Rome.
So let's unpack that initial setup. Let's start with the timeline and the people involved in getting this critical document from Greece all the way to the heart of the empire.
Okay, so the creation of Romans wasn't something Paul did in his downtime. It wasn't a leisure activity.
No.
It was generated during a pause in an otherwise extremely busy schedule, and it was necessitated by his far-reaching strategy. This detail gives us immediate context for the urgency and the systematic organization of his writing.
Okay, so let's pinpoint the setting. The sources seem to confirm that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from the city of Corinth.
Yes, and the timing places it squarely during his third missionary journey. We're talking specifically around AD 56-57.
And that dating is crucial, isn't it? It shows Paul was really at the height of his missionary career.
He was. He was finalizing his work in the Eastern Mediterranean and already planning the next great wave of expansion.
So what makes the sources so confident about Corinth specifically? I understand it has something to do with the carrier of the letter, that she ties Paul directly back to that location.
It does, yeah. The confirmation is rooted in the identity of the woman who actually carried the letter, a woman named Phoebe.
Okay.
She is described as a minister or a servant at the church in Cenchrea. And historically, Cenchrea is known as a marine suburb of Corinth.
So Cenchrea wasn't just close to Corinth, it was its port city. It was the gateway connecting Corinth to the Aegean Sea and, by extension, to the rest of the Mediterranean.
Precisely. Paul's in Corinth, which is the administrative and commercial hub of the region, and he trusts a recognized leader from its adjacent port to carry this massive document. Cenchrea was the natural point of departure for any sea journey west toward Italy.
And using Phoebe, who was a known figure in that regional church structure, to deliver a letter that contains his entire systematic theology and his future mission strategy. Well, that provides some pretty robust historical consistency for the location and date.
It really does.
That brings up a fascinating point, though, about the structure of the early church. The sources identify Phoebe as a minister of the church at Cenchrea. She wasn't just a mail carrier. What does that title suggest about the role she played?
It suggests she had considerable standing. The title used for her indicates she held a position of recognized service and leadership, a servant to the church. Paul was entrusting this deftly sensitive and theologically complex material to someone who was both trusted and capable.
She had the character and the authority to travel and present Paul's letter with his personal commendation to a church he'd never even met.
Absolutely. So now we can move from where he wrote it to why he wrote it. And this all centers on Paul's grand itinerary. We're talking Jerusalem to Spain.
And this is the key, isn't it? This letter, you realize, was not primarily written to start a mission in Rome. It was written to establish Rome as a necessary logistical stopover.
It was about using Rome as a launchpad, a forward operating base. Paul had basically completed his major evangelistic work across the Eastern Roman world, from Jerusalem up through Macedonia and Achaia.
Right.
He was now looking west toward the, uncharted territory, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain.
I think the sequential nature of his travel plan is the most telling detail about his logistical mindset. Rome was only step 2 in a 3-part operation.
That's right. His plan was highly defined. First, Jerusalem. He had an immediate, very pressing responsibility to finalize and deliver a charitable contribution.
The collection for the saints?
The collection gathered from the Gentile churches, like the one in Corinth, to the saints in Jerusalem. And this was an action of concrete unity. It was reconciliation between the Gentile and Jewish wings of the early church.
And delivering that contribution wasn't just about charity. It was politically charged and, frankly, personally dangerous for him. He even asks for prayer about it later in the letter.
Absolutely. So step 2, Rome. After Jerusalem, he planned to sail Rome to meet the existing church, share fellowship, and, most importantly, prepare his resources.
Okay, so that leads to the final destination.
Third, Spain. Assisted and resourced by the Roman believers, the very people he was writing to with his systematic treatise, he intended to depart for Spain, the westernmost edge of the Roman Empire. That was his ultimate mission goal.
Paul really viewed the entire known world as his mission field. Having done the East, the West was next.
Exactly. The sources use this really helpful comparison of a polar expedition. If you see this strategically, Jerusalem was the mission headquarters, where he filed his final report and delivered his supplies. He was closing out the previous chapter of his work.
And Rome.
Rome was the forward operating base. It was the last significant established Christian outpost. He couldn't just sail straight to Spain. That was just too vast and dangerous to do unsupported.
No, he needed to restock, refine his team, secure financial backing. And he had to introduce his mission vision to the church that would become his primary logistical partner.
And that framing makes perfect sense of the practical appeal to Rome. You have to remember, Paul had never visited Rome before writing this letter. He didn't establish that church.
It just arose organically, probably from people who heard the gospel at Pentecost and then returned home.
Most likely.
Yeah.
So he was asking for enormous support from strangers.
Which means the letter wasn't some gentle request for a casual visit. It was a formal communication. It was designed to alert them to his specific plans and to recruit their practical and material support for the Spain mission.
And that raises the stakes for the theological content that follows, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the requests he makes are purely operational. First, he asks them to pray for his immediate safety and for the successful completion of his travel plans to Jerusalem. He knew the danger he faced from non-believing Jews there.
Then he asks them to welcome him warmly when he gets to Rome, which is really asking them to confirm their willingness to partner with him.
But the culminating practical request, the whole reason he needed Rome's acceptance, was for them to provide the necessary help and resources.
The people, the funds, the provisions.
All of it. To assist him in his onward journey to Spain. This just proves that the letter to the Romans is not a simple lecture on doctrine. It's a mission funding proposal wrapped in a doctrinal treatise.
The need for logistics drives the need for theology. He had to convince them he was trustworthy, that he was doctrinally sound, and that his grand mission to the West was God's established plan.
So shifting from that logistical frame, let's get into the nature of the letter itself. The sources are clear that Romans serves a dual function where the practical and the theological just meet head-on.
It's a beautifully balanced document, really. On one hand, it's the systematic theological treatise, Paul's grand synthesis of salvation. But on the other, it's a necessary missionary document, preparing the ground for his visit and trying to secure the support he needed for Spain.
And the theological purpose was all about achieving unity and stability in right.
Yeah.
He had to strengthen the existing church by defining the core meaning of salvation, specifically outlining the righteousness of God.
Right, and providing an authoritative solution to that central tension of the early church, the relationship between Jewish and Gentile believers.
Paul was a strategist. He knew that Rome, as the imperial capital, would have believers from every background imaginable. If their church fractured along ethnic or cultural lines, Jewish traditionalists versus Gentile converts, it would jeopardize the entire Western mission.
He needed doctrinal clarity to ensure organizational cohesion.
And the missionary purpose was the immediate practical reality. The letter was the prep work for his visit and the explicit request for resources for the Spain mission. He couldn't just ask for money and people until he established his credibility, the validity of his gospel message, and the unifying force of that message.
Which brings us to a historical challenge that we should probably address. The structural debate over chapters 15 and 16. While no serious scholar doubts Paul wrote Romans, there have been historical questions about whether those last two chapters belong to the original work.
Right, and the sources give 4 reasons for this structural uncertainty that critics have used over the years. The first is manuscript evidence. Certain early manuscripts, we're talking late 2nd, early 3rd centuries, They seem to conclude the letter prematurely, at the end of chapter 14.
So if a shorter version existed that early, it kind of opens the door to the argument that maybe Paul sent different versions to different churches, or that the original was just shorter.
It does. The second point centers on the multiple endings. The letter has 3 doxologies, those formal bursts of praise and blessing.
One at 15.33, one at 16.24, and another at 16.27.
Yeah, so if an author typically concludes with one doxology, having 3 suggests potential additions or maybe later editorial work, it creates a puzzle. Any one of those would make a suitable closing, so critics ask, which one is the real ending?
And then there are textual variations, which further confuses the issue.
It does. In some manuscripts, the very last verses, 16.2527, sometimes appear at the end of chapter 14, which seems to reinforce the argument that chapter 14 was the planned conclusion for at least some versions.
And finally, the objection that feels the most intuitive, the personal greetings. Critics asked why Paul would include such a long, detailed list of personal greetings in chapter 16, naming dozens of specific people for a church he had never visited.
It seems out of place, right, for a letter introducing himself to strangers.
It does sound like a pretty compelling case for a composite document. So how do our sources address these points and defend the idea that Romans, as we have it in all 16 chapters, is a single literary whole?
The counter-arguments are very robust,
Yeah.
and they center on theological history. The existence of that shorter version, the one ending at chapter 14, is strongly attributed to the influence of one man, Marcion.
Marcion, the 2nd century heretic who fundamentally rejected the Old Testament.
That's him. He taught that the God of the Old Testament was a different, lesser being than the Father of Jesus Christ. He wanted to sever any connection between Christianity and Judaism.
So, given that bias, the content of the letter after chapter 14 becomes immediately suspicious to him.
Oh, absolutely. Romans 15.129 is all about discussing the preparatory work of Judaism. It quotes Old Testament promises, it stresses the need for unity, arguing that Christ came to confirm the promises made to the patriarchs.
An affirmation of God's faithfulness to Israel. That would have been completely antithetical to Marcion's whole theology.
Totally. So the argument is that Marcion didn't preserve the original shorter version. He intentionally edited the letter to remove the parts that undermined his doctrinal position.
So the shortening was an act of theological censorship?
Precisely. It's a critical insight that helps us understand why a shorter version existed so early in church history.
Okay, that handles the manuscript issue. But what about that long list of greetings? How could Paul possibly know so many people in a city he'd never even been to?
This is resolved by just practical social history. Rome was the capital of the empire. It was a magnet for trade, commerce, and administration. The individuals mentioned in chapter 16 were very likely former colleagues and ministry partners of Paul who had since moved to Rome.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. Paul's ministry base covered major cities like Corinth and Ephesus. It's entirely plausible, even expected, that his contacts would eventually move to the capital.
Right.
So listing them by name would serve a dual purpose. It vouches for Paul's connections and character to the Roman church leadership, and at the same time, it leverages his network to make sure he has friendly faces ready to host him and assist with the Spain mission.
It acts as an introduction by proxy. It says, I may not know you, Rome, but I know Aquila and Prisca. I know Epaenetus, and they know me. It strengthens his credibility.
And finally, what about the multiple doxologies?
The defense here is stylistic. Paul frequently interjects doxologies throughout his writings, often after a major section of argumentation.
Like at the end of Romans 11.
Exactly. He breaks into praise in Romans 11.33 after concluding his defense of God's plan for Israel. His literary style is dynamic. It often moves seamlessly from this rigorous argument to spontaneous praise. So the multiple endings really just reflect his natural impassioned rhythm, not editorial tampering.
The analogy from the sources really clarifies this. The shorter version is like an editor removing the final chapter of a classic novel because they didn't like how a subplot was resolved. The shortened version isn't the original, it's just a biased truncation.
So we should view Romans as the 16-chapter literary whole that it is.
Okay, so with the integrity of the letter established, let's move to the theological core, the actual blueprint Paul was using to secure the Roman Church's allegiance.
Right. Paul wrote Romans to systematically outline the meaning of salvation in Jesus Christ, and he's making the case that this doctrine is the very bedrock of Christianity.
And the paramount theme that unifies all 16 chapters is the righteousness of God. The thematic statement is laid out right there in 1.1617. But this theme isn't just about human righteousness. It's about the vindication of God's own character.
That's the key insight. The entire letter serves as a defense and vindication of God's nature. Paul is arguing that God is absolutely holy and just, yet his plan of salvation allows him to be both just and the justifier of those who believe. That's from 3.26.
He has to show how a righteous God can declare unrighteous people righteous without compromising his own integrity.
And the sources outline this grand structure using a five-stage approach. It moves methodically from the universal problem to the universal solution, and finally to practical application.
So stage 1, the universal need for salvation. This is the diagnosis, chapters 1.18 through 3.10.
Right. Paul begins with the diagnosis, establishing the fatal condition of humanity. He uses two major sections to prove that sin is a universal plight, touching every corner of the earth and every social status.
First, he addresses the Gentiles.
Starting in 1.18, he argues that the wrath of God is revealed against those who suppress the truth that is clearly seen in creation. The Gentiles, who didn't have the revealed law of Moses, are still held accountable for exchanging the natural knowledge of God for idolatry and moral degradation.
They are without excuse.
Without excuse. The resulting judgment, Paul argues, is God giving them up to the consequences of their choices, this downward spiral of immorality and ungodliness. This establishes the universality of condemnation based on rejecting natural revelation.
Then he turns the mirror. He turns it toward the Jews, starting in chapter 2. They have the law, the covenants, all the unique historical privileges.
But Paul demonstrates that merely possessing the law doesn't save them. Only keeping it does. And since they fail to keep it, their privilege actually becomes their greater condemnation.
This is the hammer blow that shatters any idea of human boasting. Whether you're judged by the light of nature like the Gentiles or the light of the revealed law like the Jews, both are found guilty.
Which leads to the famous conclusion that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God in 3.23. It's the summary statement of the entire diagnosis.
The law's function, therefore, isn't to justify.
No, Paul explicitly states that the law brings the knowledge of sin. That's in 3.2 off. It shuts every mouth and brings the entire world under the judicial scrutiny of God. The remedy has to be something entirely new, because the existing moral structure only confirms the disease.
Which brings us to stage 2, the provision of righteousness by faith, the cure, chapters 3.21 through 4.25.
This is the dramatic shift from condemnation to liberation. Having proven the universal diagnosis, Paul now introduces the cure, the righteousness of God revealed apart from human works or law-keeping.
This righteousness is a declaration. It's granted freely through faith in the atoning work of Christ. Christ serves as a propitiation, the wrath-averting sacrifice.
And it applies to everyone. The atonement for all is the great leveling agent. The remedy is just as universal as the sin.
This is where Paul introduces the core Reformed teaching of justification. And it's so critical to get this right. It's not about making us righteous internally. It's a legal declaration that we are righteous in God's eyes, based entirely on the imputed righteousness of Christ.
It's a change in legal status. And because this idea was so radical, especially to a Jewish audience accustomed to law, Paul immediately goes back to the Old Testament to prove that this provision by faith is not some new invention.
Right. He uses the examples of Abraham and David in chapter 4.
And his selection of Abraham as the prime exhibit is just genius.
So how does Paul use Abraham to prove that righteousness is received through faith, not through ethnic or ceremonial distinction?
He asks a very simple question. When was Abraham justified? It was when he believed God's promise, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And critically, this happened before he was circumcised, the sign of the covenant, and centuries before the law of Moses was even given.
So Abraham was declared righteous while he was, in essence, still a Gentile.
Precisely. This makes Abraham the spiritual father, not only of the believing Jews, but also of all believing Gentiles. It reinforces Paul's claim that God's plan includes all nations and that his method of salvation has always been the same: grace received by faith.
The sources really highlight this chapter as proof that righteousness is a gift entirely apart from biological descent or following the Mosaic Code.
And then he uses David, who lived under the law, to show that forgiveness of sins is also a grace-based gift. He quotes Psalm 32, the blessedness of the man to whom God counts righteousness apart from works.
It completes the argument. Whether before the law, outside the law, or under the law, justification comes through faith alone.
Okay, so having established the objective fact of justification, Paul now turns to the practical implications. This is stage 3, the recovery process, in chapters 5 through 8. If our status is changed, What does that mean for our experience?
The first benefit is immediate. Peace with God. That's 5.1. We're no longer rebels under divine wrath. We're reconciled children.
Then chapters 5 through 8 systematically detail the freedoms we acquire. Chapter 6 describes our freedom from sin's power. Because we've been united with Christ in his death and resurrection, we are declared dead to sin.
Which means we are free not just from sin's penalty, that's justification, but from its dominion. Sin is no longer our master.
But the sources stress a necessary distinction here that often confuses people. It's the difference between our new position and our daily experience. Paul addresses this head-on in chapter 7.
This is the vital discussion on sanctification, the ongoing process of recovery.
It is, and Paul maintains a very realistic view. In chapter 7, he acknowledges that believers will still struggle experientially with the reality of sin. When he cries out, "For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want," he's describing that inner conflict.
The conflict between the justified person and the lingering presence of the flesh, or remaining sin.
Exactly. This inner battle proves that while justification is a completed status, from stage 2, sanctification, or living out that righteousness, is a continuous, lifelong battle against the sin that remains within us.
So it's crucial to see chapter 7 as the bridge between the positional reality of chapter 6 and the victorious provision of chapter 8.
And that tension resolves in the glorious declaration of chapter 8. This chapter describes the believer's complete freedom from death, and it provides the solution to the chapter 7 struggle, the Holy Spirit.
The Spirit is the agent of sanctification.
He is. He provides the means to put to death the deeds of the body. The opening line of chapter 8 is the conclusion of the entire theological argument. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus.
That addresses our status. But then chapter 8 moves to assurance, proclaiming that nothing can separate us from the love of God, guaranteeing our future resurrection and final glory. It's really the high water mark of Paul's systematic argument.
It is. But once Paul establishes the universality of salvation by faith, a major theological and historical question comes up. It's one he knew the Roman Church would be grappling with.
If Gentiles are now being included, has God abandoned Israel?
Right. So Paul has to dedicate 3 entire chapters to this. This is stage 4, the defense of God's justice and plan.
This section begins with Paul's anguished defense of God's faithfulness. He starts by acknowledging the immense historical priority and advantage of the Jews. They received the covenants, the adoption, the glory, the law.
But he clarifies that physical descent from Abraham does not automatically guarantee participation in God's saving plan. Paul uses the Old Testament examples of Isaac over Ishmael and Jacob over Esau to show that God's electing purpose has always been sovereign.
It's based on his choice, not on human will or effort.
Correct. And this serves to reconcile God's sovereignty with his justice. He is absolutely free to choose whom he will.
But how does he address the tension between the election of some and the apparent rejection of the majority of Israel?
He stresses that since there is only one God, he is the God of both Gentiles and Jews. The law proves all are under sin, and Christ's sacrifice redeems all who believe, regardless of background. God's ultimate goal is the universal application of the same standard.
So the central argument is that God's purposes weren't thwarted by Israel's unbelief. In fact, Israel's temporary hardening created the necessary space to bring the Gentiles into the fold.
Paul uses the famous analogy of the olive tree in chapter 11 to illustrate Israel's place. The natural branches, Israel, were temporarily broken off due to unbelief, which allowed the wild branches, the Gentiles, to be grafted in.
And this image forces the Gentile believers in Rome to remain humble. They can't boast against the original root because they have to recognize that their salvation is entirely dependent upon God's prior covenant with Israel.
And Paul provides a future hope. God has not cast off Israel entirely. He maintains a believing remnant. But more than that, Paul reveals a mystery, that Israel is temporarily blinded until the full number of the Gentiles has come in.
And after that event, all Israel will be saved.
Right. This systemic explanation does 2 things. It humbles the Gentile church, and it completely vindicates God's wisdom and goodness. Paul proves that God's plan holds together his justice, his mercy, and his faithfulness to his original promises. It's a stunning piece of theological architecture.
And that section appropriately concludes with that spontaneous explosion of praise, praising the inscrutable nature of God's wisdom and knowledge.
So after 11 dense chapters establishing the objective reality of the gospel, what God has done, we get to stage 5. Paul pivots immediately to the subjective response, what we must now do. This section outlines the responsibilities of the Christian life and ministry.
It begins with one of the most quotable verses in the New Testament, the instruction to present our bodies as a living sacrifice in 12.1. And this is presented as a logical conclusion to everything that came before. If we've been justified and assured of salvation, the only reasonable response is total dedication to God.
And the application then covers righteousness and service within the Roman Church. Paul details the need for unity despite diverse spiritual gifts, stressing that every gift is given for the common good and that every member is necessary for the proper functioning of the body.
He then immediately moves to practical societal instruction, something the Roman Church needed desperately given their location in the capital city. He instructs them on submitting to governing authorities in chapter 13.
This instruction is essential in Rome, where the emperor was, for all intents and purposes, a god. Paul insists that all governing authority is established by God and Christians must be subject to it, not for fear of punishment, but for the sake of conscience.
That was a critical instruction for Christians living in a pagan empire.
It was. But perhaps the most vital application, given the internal tensions Paul anticipated, is the management of conflict between those with varying convictions, the weak and strong believers in chapter 14.
And this conflict was rooted in cultural differences. The weak brother, often the Jewish believer, might be sensitive about eating meat that may have been sacrificed to idols or about observing certain Sabbath days.
While a strong brother, usually the Gentile convert, recognized that these ceremonial laws were fulfilled in Christ and felt free to eat or disregard special days.
And Paul tells the strong not to despise the weak, and the weak not to judge the strong. How does the core theology inform this practical advice?
He grounds the tolerance in the objective truth of chapter 8. He says, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. That's 14.8. Since Christ has accepted both the weak and the strong, neither group has the right to condemn the other over matters of personal conviction that don't violate core doctrine.
So the ultimate principle is love and building one another up, not tearing each other down over secondary issues.
Right. This shows the immediate utility of Paul's systematic theology. He uses the objective truth of justification to enforce the ethical mandate of unity in the church, making the Roman Church functional enough to become his strategic base.
And then, after covering all the internal and external behavior, he circles back to the mission.
He does. He provides the final logistical details, his travel plans, his hope to secure their support, and then concludes with that extensive list of personal greetings. This final chapter, which was once disputed, now perfectly ties together the organizational strategy of the whole letter.
The greetings confirm his connection, Phoebe's role confirms the delivery, and the final benediction reinforces the doctrinal stability needed for the mission. It is a masterpiece of unified structure.
So this deep dive has shown us that Paul's letter to the Romans is so much more than a theological exercise. It is a meticulously crafted document that is at the same time a grand architectural blueprint for salvation and a practical, sophisticated recruitment and fundraising proposal.
All to extend the gospel to the far reaches of the Roman world, specifically Spain.
And the core takeaway is really rooted in the letter's structure itself. Paul moves from the universal diagnosis of sin affecting both Jew and Gentile to the universal provision of righteousness through faith, and then he applied that faith to foster unity in action.
This progression is Paul's ultimate vindication of God's nature. His plan holds together his absolute justice while granting salvation through grace to all who believe.
We covered the historical necessity of the mission Jerusalem as the report filing, Rome as the strategic forward operating base, and Spain as the grand destination. We examined the structural debate, clarifying Marcion's influence, and then walked through Paul's five-stage argument.
Establishing the need for the cure, detailing the cure itself, showing the resulting recovery process of sanctification, defending God's faithfulness to Israel, and finally applying that doctrine to daily living. From submission to authority to maintaining unity between the weak and the strong.
Which provides you with an important thought to consider. If Paul viewed the established, secure church in Rome, the capital city, the center of the world at the time, not as a culmination of the mission, but only as a necessary base camp for a greater mission into uncharted territory like Spain, what does that perspective suggest about how we should view the purpose and focus of the established church in our own time? Should the church today ever view its current location as its final objective?
Thank you for sharing your sources with us. We hope this deep dive provides you with significant, fresh insight into the systematic context and structure of Paul's letter to the Romans.